I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding in Lake Como, the very wedding I had spent tens of thousands of dollars helping to pay for. He didn't call me. He sent me an email instead. "Dad, the ceremony is very private. But don't worry, I've arranged a live stream so you can watch it from home." So I simply replied, "Of course. I hope your wedding will be perfect." The next morning, my phone kept ringing nonstop. I figured my son must have been very panicked, and me, I didn't care, because this was the expensive lesson I had prepared for him. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Before we begin, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss future stories. Remember to stay warm and take care of your health. Note, this is a fictional story with dramatized details. Any resemblance to real names or places is purely coincidental. The deepest wounds aren't carved by enemies, but by the people you spent 35 years shielding from the world. It was 5 a.m. on Thursday, September 25th, 2025 in Cleveland, the kind of hour where the darkness feels thick enough to touch, and the only witness to your life is the persistent, low-frequency hum of a refrigerator that has seen better decades. I sat at my kitchen table, the blue glow of my laptop screen casting a ghostly pallor over my hands. My fingers felt stiff, a combination of the early morning chill and the lingering arthritis that comes from a lifetime of gripping chalk and grading papers. I had opened my inbox to find an email from my eldest son, Alex. The subject line was, "Update on Italy plans," phrased with the clinical detachment of a middle manager briefing a shareholder on a corporate merger. I stared at the cursor blinking in the silence, while the smell of stale air and the bitter metallic taste of cold coffee settled in my throat. Frank Miller, a 60-year-old man who had taught calculus for 35 years, sat in my quiet Cleveland kitchen, staring at an email that defied all logic. As I began to read, the entry twist struck me with the force of a physical blow. Alex wasn't just adjusting the schedule. He was explaining that the mother of the bride, Signora Elena, had voiced concerns about the working-class aesthetic of the guest list. She wanted a pure, aristocratic ceremony in Lake Como, and apparently a retired Midwestern teacher didn't fit the visual profile of the life Alex was trying to build for himself in Italy. Have you ever felt the exact moment your heart turns from meat to stone? I did, right between the third and fourth paragraph of that digital execution. I have spent my life calculating variables and solving for X, believing that if you put in the work and provide the foundation, the result will eventually balance. But there is no formula for this kind of betrayal. Alex continued, his words appearing on the screen with a terrifying, polished ease. He explained that to avoid any social friction or stress regarding travel, they had arranged a high-definition premium live-stream link for me. I could watch the ceremony, the one I had already sent $30,000, to help fund from the comfort of my own home 3,000 miles away. The justification was phrased as a kindness, a way to keep me involved, without the distracting reality of my presence. I felt a surge of righteous indignation, a heat that started in my chest and radiated outward until my face felt flushed in the blue light. The logic was insulting. It suggested that my years of labor, the double shifts at the tutoring center, and the quiet sacrifices of my own comfort were worth exactly the price of a high-speed internet connection and a digital seat in the nosebleed section of his new life. Pure, aristocratic, unfitting. The words felt like physical slaps. I am a man of grounded reality, a man who knows that a bridge only stands if the pylons are driven deep into the mud. Yet my own son was treating me like a surface blemish on a polished marble floor. I looked down at the very bottom of the screen, my eyes narrowing as I caught a detail I had missed in my initial shock. There in the CC field was my younger son Tyler's email address. The timestamp showed the message had been sent to him hours before it ever reached me. He hadn't just known. He had watched the plan unfold in silence, an accomplice to my exclusion. I looked at the bottom of the screen and saw my younger son's email address in the CC field. He hadn't just known, he had watched it happen. The chalk snapped between my fingers, a sharp, white crack that echoed through the silence of third-period calculus. I stared at the two jagged pieces in my palm, the fine white dust coating my calloused skin like a layer of ash. I had spent 35 years at Lincoln High School, and I knew every creak of these floorboards, every flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights, and the exact smell of floor wax and old books that permeated the hallways. But today, the mechanical nature of my movements was the only thing keeping me from shattering just like that chalk. Before leaving my kitchen, I had looked again at that digital betrayal, seeing the entry twist that I hadn't fully processed in the dawn light. Tyler hadn't just been a passive observer in the CC field. He had replied to the thread an hour before I saw it. His words were a cold, calculated endorsement of Alex's exclusion, claiming I might make things awkward with the Castiglione family and that a live stream would be safer for everyone. My youngest son, the one I'd bailed out of 3 different gambling debts, was now helping to curate my absence. I turned back to the board, my voice sounding distant even to myself, as I continued the lecture on limits and variables. Variables change class. Constants stay the same. Or at least that's what the textbooks lie to you about. My students were unusually still. Usually this group is a chaotic swarm of teenage hormones and rustling paper, but they seemed to sense the icy precision in my demeanor. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The dry dust of the eraser felt like sandpaper against my fingertips as I wiped away an incorrect derivative. Teaching calculus is like herding cats through a minefield of logic. Usually I care if they step on a mine. Today I was interested in the blast radius. I began to derive a complex limit on the board, my mind drifting toward the $158,000 currently sitting in an escrow account. The blood of my family home, which I had sold to fund Alex's European fantasies. I looked at the class, the brass school keys heavy in my pocket, and realized the math of my life was fundamentally broken. I was being treated as a divisor, a value meant to be split, until nothing remained for myself. Look at your own children. Do they see a person, or do they see a vending machine that occasionally dispenses wisdom and frequently dispenses cash? Today, we aren't just solving for X, I told them, my eyes fixed on a girl in the front row who was actually paying attention. We're looking at what happens when the equation collapses. When the denominator reaches 0, the function is undefined. It doesn't exist anymore. I realized at that moment that I was the denominator, and I was about to go to 0. I thought about the power of attorney. I still held over the house proceeds money Alex had already promised to the Conte to secure his place in their aristocratic circle. He had sold a future that wasn't his to trade. The bell rang, vibrating through the slate board and into my bones, but I didn't reach for my lunch bag. I reached for my car keys, knowing that the bank manager would still be at his desk, and my son's future was currently sitting in a vault I held the key to. At 4:30 p.m. that same Thursday afternoon, I didn't bother checking the unseasonable Cleveland wind as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of Lake Erie Federal Credit Union. I was focused on the heavy silence of a bank account about to be gutted. The transition from the chalkboard dust of Lincoln High to the sterile, climate-controlled air of Lake Erie Federal Credit Union felt like crossing into a combat zone. I moved with a surgical precision, my mind already calculating the reversal of the $58,000 Alex had considered a foregone conclusion. Carlos Rodriguez, a bank manager, whose sharp suits and soft eyes had witnessed every financial milestone of my life for 20 years, looked at me with professional concern as I sat in his office. I didn't wait for the pleasantries. I laid out the paperwork for the pending wire transfer to the villa and the catering service in Lake Como. Carlos hesitated, leaning back in his leather chair. He reminded me that this money was earmarked for the wedding vendors. He noted that they would lose their deposits, and the reservation for the venue would be forfeit. I looked at him, my face a mask of iron, and explained that the $58,000 wasn't just a gift. It was the last of the equity from the house my own father helped me buy, a legacy Alex had promised as a guarantee to Señora Elena to prove his social worth. "Are you sure about this, Frank?" he asked, his fountain pen hovering. "This is for the catering and the villa. They'll lose the deposits." I didn't flinch. "The only thing being lost today, Carlos, is my patience. Cancel it." I took the pen from his hand and signed the cancellation forms with the same finality I used to grade a failing exam. The scratch of the nib on the official forms was the most satisfying sound I had heard all year. Click. The transfer was gone. Just like 30 years of trust. I walked back out to the parking lot, the glare of the setting sun through the windshield hitting me like a physical interrogation. I sat in my car, the interior smelling of old upholstery and the lingering scent of chalk, and composed a single group message to Alex and Tyler. I typed it with a steady thumb: "Wedding funds canceled. Enjoy your elite celebration via the link you provided. Dad." I watched the delivered status appear beneath the text, knowing I had just detonated a social nuclear device in Italy. "Do you hear that? It's the sound of an aristocratic dream meeting the reality of a teacher's pension." I felt no guilt, only a cold, righteous finality. As I drove toward my driveway, I began to scan the mental copy of the vendor contracts Alex had sent me months ago. I realized that the $25,000 deposit I had already sent months back wasn't necessarily a total loss, due to a specific clause in the force majeure section that Alex had clearly never bothered to read. I could technically recover most of it if the cancellation was handled through a specific legal channel. My son had been so busy playing at nobility that he had forgotten to check the math of his own safety net. I pulled into my driveway, the engine cutting out, just as my phone didn't just buzz. It screamed Alex's name, flashing across the dashboard like a warning light on a failing engine. But I didn't reach for it. I reached for my garage door opener. Silence has a specific weight when you know the people you love are currently screaming your name through a digital void. I stepped into the foyer of my house, the heavy garage door sealing shut behind me with a finality that the air outside lacked. My phone continued to pulse against my thigh, a frantic, rhythmic vibration that I chose to ignore as I navigated the familiar darkness of the hallway. The house felt like a museum where someone had just smashed the glass cases, an alien structure that had once been a home, but now served as a repository for 35 years of misplaced trust. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need a son's gratitude tonight. I needed my father's ghost. I moved toward the stairs, my eyes adjusting to the gray silhouettes of the furniture. I had lived in this Cleveland split level for decades, yet I felt like an intruder walking through the wreckage of a peace treaty. As I reached the bedroom, I realized the safe wasn't just left open. The code had been reset to a default I hadn't used in years, suggesting the intruder had time to linger and play with the very logic of my security. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under my weight. The air smelled of cedar and old paper, a scent that usually promised comfort, but now carried the acrid tang of a violation. My goal was simple. I wanted to touch the cold steel of my father's 1982 Omega Seamaster. It was the only constant left in an equation that had been solved with a deficit. Opening a safe is a lot like solving a quadratic equation. One wrong move and the whole thing remains locked behind an invisible wall of logic. My fingers found the dial by mechanical memory, though my mind was elsewhere. I noticed a minute scratch near the keypad, a silver scar on the black finish that hadn't been there when I tucked my documents away last Tuesday. The click of the locking mechanism was a dull, heavy sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I swung the door open, the hinges moving with a familiar oiled silence. The red velvet box was sitting exactly where it should be centered, on the middle shelf next to my birth certificate and my pension papers. My hands didn't shake until I felt the weight of the box, or rather the lack of it. It felt lighter than it did a month ago, as if the very atoms of the object inside had evaporated into the stagnant air of the bedroom. Empty. The word didn't just describe the box. It described the last 30 years of my life. I stared down into the hollow center of the velvet. The lock hadn't been forced. It had been opened by someone who knew the numbers, someone I had trusted with the keys to my sanctuary. I reached into the void of the box, my fingers brushing against something thin and sharp. It wasn't the watch. It was a small, rectangular piece of paper. I pulled it out, bringing it close to my face to catch the dim light from the hallway. It was a receipt with a pawn shop address printed in bold, unyielding ink. The red velvet was still indented with the shape of the watch, a hollow ghost of my father's 40 years of sweat and steel now gone. The thief hadn't even bothered to hide the evidence of the liquidation. They had left the receipt in the empty cradle like a mocking signature on a death warrant. I didn't answer the phone. I let it scream in my pocket until the silence of the room became more aggressive than the ringing. Standing over the hollow safe, I stared at the empty red velvet cradle where 40 years of my father's labor had once rested. The air in the bedroom felt heavy, charged with the ozone of a distant storm, but the real electricity was pulsing in my hand. Finally, the ringing stopped, only to be replaced seconds later by a rhythmic, persistent vibration. Tyler. I pulled the device out and stared at his name flashing across the screen. I answered without a greeting, letting the cold vacuum of my bedroom do the talking for me. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing on the other end. Then the floodgates opened. "Dad! Dad, are you there? You can't just kill the wire transfer. Signora Elena is going to crucify Alex if the villa doesn't get that deposit by morning." I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the silver scratch on the safe dial. "I'm looking at the safe, Tyler," I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor on a dead man. "Tell me why the velvet is empty." There was a sharp, audible hitch in his breath, the sound of a glass wall shattering. I didn't need to be in the room with him to know his face was draining of color. Tyler's defensive posture didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He had been the one to check the safe code for Alex weeks ago, making sure the old default still worked while I was out at the hardware store. "It was just a bridge, Dad. Alex said he only needed a temporary bridge to satisfy the Castiglione family's expectations for the dowry. He swore he'd replace it before you even noticed." I felt the heat of the phone against my ear, but my internal temperature was dropping toward absolute zero. He called it a bridge. I called it a grave for our family legacy. There was no room for error in this equation anymore. My sons had converted my father's sweat into a down payment on a lie of nobility. How do you teach a grown man that some variables aren't for sale? I'd failed that lesson somewhere in the last 30 years of raising them to believe the world owed them a soft landing. I listened to Tyler's frantic stammering, my own throat feeling dry and paper-like as the disgust settled in. Every word he spoke confirmed the premeditated nature of the theft. They had sat in this very house, perhaps at the kitchen table where I grade my exams and calculated the liquidation of my history. It wasn't just a desperate grab, it was a strategy. In his mounting panic, Tyler's logic began to fray completely. He let slip a detail that turned the cold in my veins to ice. The watch wasn't just sitting in a shop waiting to be redeemed. Alex hadn't just pawned it. He had used it as collateral for a private loan from a man Tyler sounded terrified of, someone who didn't deal in bank hours or legal contracts. "Dad, if Alex doesn't get that money back to the shop, he's not just losing the watch, he's losing everything," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling with a genuine fear I had never heard before. Then the line went dead, leaving me in a room that felt too small to contain the rage I was about to unleash. Headlights cut through the Cleveland mist, sweeping across my living room wall like a searchlight looking for a fugitive. I stood behind the screen door, my silhouette as rigid as a sentry's. The car idled in the driveway for a long, agonizing minute, its engine a low, rhythmic growl that matched the thrum of my own pulse. Finally, the ignition clicked off, and the silence of the night rushed back in, heavy and damp with the smell of lake air. Tyler Miller, my 29-year-old younger son, stood on my porch, with the hunched shoulders of a man perpetually hiding from his own shadow. He was a landscape architect who seemed more comfortable with blueprints than bloodlines, and right now he looked like he wanted to dissolve into the concrete. "You look like a man who hasn't slept, Tyler," I said, not moving to let him in, "or a man who's been running." He didn't look up, his eyes fixed on his own scuffed boots. "I didn't want any of this, Dad." Alex said it was the only way. The entry twist felt like a new fracture in a broken bone. Tyler admitted that weeks ago, Alex had forced him to film me during a practice run, recording my reaction to a false alarm, just to see if the safe code was still the same. I stepped aside, and the damp mist followed him into the hallway. We migrated to the kitchen, where the cold linoleum floor seemed to leach the heat from my feet. Tyler sat at the table, his hands trembling so violently that his teeth began a faint staccato chatter. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer against my skull. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't offer him anything. Think about that for a second. Truffles. A mushroom that grows in dirt was more important to my son than his own heritage. Tyler spilled the numbers with the frantic desperation of a man emptying a sinking boat. Alex had pawned our history, the 1982 Omega Seamaster, for a mere $5,500. It was a fraction of its value, a rounding error in a life built on steel and sweat. Alex had needed the cash for a rehearsal dinner designed to dazzle the Castiglione family. He wanted vintage Brunello and a specific grade of Italian fungi to prove he belonged to a world that would never have him. $5,500. I repeated the math, tasting like poison. That's what 40 years of Grandpa's life was worth to your brother. Tyler's face was slick with an oily sheen of sweat that caught the fluorescent light. He whispered about Signora Elena and the need for old money taste, as if a luxury label could mask the rot in his character. Shame is a powerful motivator, but greed is a god that demands human sacrifices. I watched my son, a man I had fed and clothed and bailed out of gambling debts, and I realized he wasn't just a bystander. He admitted that he had taken a $500 silence fee from Alex 3 weeks ago, the exact night the watch disappeared, to clear an immediate threat from a local bookie who had been calling him every hour. He hadn't just watched the house burn, he'd taken a handful of embers to warm his own hands. I looked at my younger son and realized the rot didn't stop at Alex. It had seeped through the entire foundation of what I thought was my family. The realization was as cold and precise as the calculus I taught every morning. Grief isn't just about what you've lost. It's about the ghost of the routine you can't seem to quit. I sat at my desk in the empty classroom, the sterile smell of dry erase markers hanging heavy in the air during my free period. The school was a hive of muffled noise beyond the cinder-block walls, but in here the silence was amplified by the physical absence of weight on my left wrist. Instinctively, my right thumb and forefinger reached across to begin the ritual I had performed for 44 years. I caught my hand mid-air, a clawed gesture grasping at nothing but the pale strip of skin where the Omega Seamaster used to live. I looked at my bare skin and felt more naked than if I'd walked into school without a shirt. It was 16,000 nights of steel clicking against steel, now reduced to a phantom itch. I remembered a conversation from years ago, one that had seemed harmless at the time. Alex had asked for the watch as a graduation gift, a bold request even then. My refusal had been firm-rooted in the idea that some things are earned, not gifted. I see now that was the precise moment the gears began to turn in his head, a long-con calculation to bypass the lock on my safe. Memory is a treacherous calculator. It always rounds up the good times and omits the interest on the pain. Sitting there, I was pulled back to 1982 to the retirement party at Cleveland Steel Works. The room had been filled with the roar of heavy machinery and the scratchy wool of ill-fitting suits. Patrick Sullivan. My father was a man whose skin always smelled of ozone and machine oil, a giant of the works who looked at his retirement watch like it was a holy relic. He was already gray and breathless from the heart that would fail him just 3 months later, but his grip was like a vice as he pulled 16-year-old me into the corner. He placed the cold, heavy steel of the Omega in my palm. "Time is the only thing you can't buy back, Frankie," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the industrial hum. "Don't waste it on people who think you're a variable they can delete. This steel isn't just a watch. It's the physical proof that I existed." I held that weight, then promising to keep the rhythm, never imagining it would be traded for a plate of mushrooms in Lake Como. "If someone sold your father's legacy for a plate of mushrooms, would you still call them son?" I looked down at my desk, my eyes tracing the wood grain, feeling the righteous indignation simmer into a cold, hard resolve. Alex was 3,000 miles away, likely sipping vintage Brunello on someone else's dime, unaware that the foundation of his aristocratic masquerade had already been demolished. I realized that if I didn't reach out and initiate the conversation right now, the scandal would hit those Italian socialites before Alex even knew his funding was dead. The denominator of our relationship had hit 0, and I was no longer interested in the remainder. I felt a strange clinical detachment, the kind I usually reserve for grading a particularly hopeless midterm. The school bell suddenly screamed a sharp ring that shattered the 1982 fog and vibrated through my teeth. I realized I wasn't winding a watch anymore. I was winding myself up for the call that would end my son's masquerade. It was time to show him the true cost of his arithmetic. I didn't use my cell phone. I used the heavy beige landline on my desk, wanting the connection to feel as old and industrial as the man Alex had just betrayed. The plastic smell of the old receiver was a sharp contrast to the digital sterile air of the modern world, a tactile reminder of the foundations Alex was currently trying to incinerate. I dialed the international code for Italy, the numbers burning into my mind like the final lines of a proof that had gone horribly wrong. As the transatlantic static crackled in my ear, I sat back in my chair, my eyes fixed on the cold linoleum of the classroom floor. The international ringing tone began a slow, rhythmic pulse that sounded more like a warning than a call. On the third ring, the connection clicked. The background was an immediate assault of opulent sound, the clink of crystal, the murmur of refined voices, and the distant melodic chirp of Italian birds in a sun-drenched garden. Dad Alex's voice was bright, buoyant, and entirely unaware of the wreckage he'd left behind. "Why are you calling? Did you see the link I sent?" "I didn't call to talk about a link, Alex," I said, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp in my mouth. "I called to ask why your grandfather's watch is sitting in a pawn shop window on West 25th Street. The silence that followed was so absolute, it felt like the line had been severed. The clinking of glasses in Lake Como stopped abruptly. I could hear the muffled sound of footsteps as Alex moved away from the crowd, likely ducking into some marble-floored corridor. When he finally spoke, the buoyance was gone, replaced by a defensive edge that didn't even bother with a lie. He admitted with a chilling lack of shame that he hadn't just pawned the watch. He had presented it to the Castigliones as an ancestral heirloom, a physical sacrifice of his own history, to prove his devotion to their daughter. Merging, asset, mandatory. He wasn't a son anymore. He was a corporate brochure. He started talking about the rehearsal dinner as a mandatory investment in his future, a necessary move to secure the Castiglione merger. "It's just a watch, Dad. I'll buy you a better one once the deal goes through. You can't buy back 40 years of sweat, Alex. You sold a part of me to buy a dinner for people who don't even want me at the table. Have you ever heard the sound of your own legacy being liquidated for a plate of mushrooms? It sounds exactly like Alex's breathing, fast, shallow, and utterly devoid of weight. He continued to justify the theft, as if he were explaining a sensible business pivot, reducing my father's entire existence to a dormant asset he'd finally made useful. He was so focused on Signora Elena's approval that he failed to notice the floor had already been removed from beneath him. Then came the final insult, He revealed that the premium livestream wasn't his idea of inclusion, but a requirement from the villa vendors to ensure no unvetted guests physically occupied the limited space. I was a security risk to my own son's vanity. Alex's voice suddenly turned sharp and ugly. If you really loved me, you'd be happy that watch finally did something useful for my career. And for the first time in 60 years, I didn't feel like a father. I felt like a creditor who was finished with the excuses. There is a specific kind of quiet that follows the death of a relationship, a hollow ringing in the ear that sounds exactly like 33 years of wasted effort. I let the silence hang over the transatlantic line, ignoring the static hum that felt like white noise over a grave. Alex had just suggested that stealing my father's watch was a favor to my career, a final insult that stripped away any remaining warmth I felt for the man he had become. I took a deep breath, my fist clenching against the desk until the wood groaned. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a forensic accountant. You borrowed money from your future mother-in-law, Alex, at 12% interest, I asked, my voice dropping into a register of clinical detachment. You didn't join a family. You signed a lease on a life you can't afford. Alex's voice wavered, the sound of Italian luxury in the background, the clinking glasses and laughter fading as he realized the power shift. It's an investment, Dad, he hissed. Once I'm a Castiglione, this will all be pennies. It was nauseatingly clear. He was hopelessly compromised, a puppet in a high-interest trap, set by the very elitists he was dying to impress. Do you know what happens to a house of cards when the basement floods? It doesn't just fall, it dissolves. I sat in my classroom, the smell of rain on hot pavement wafting through the cracked window, and began to pull the final thread. Alex had been double-dipping, playing a game of financial mirrors between me and his mother. You took $15,000 from Patricia last month for venue fees, I said, leaning into the receiver. I was writing a check for that exact same amount on the same day. Where is that $30,000, Alex? The silence on the other end was heavy, pregnant with the realization that his fraud was out in the open. Then came the twist that turned my indignation into cold, hard fury. He stammered out an admission that he'd used my social security number as a secondary guarantor for one of Signora Elena's loans, assuming I'd be too distracted by the wedding to notice a hit to my credit. The betrayal was no longer just emotional, it was a criminal calculation. He had bartered my future to buy himself a temporary seat at a table that was already being pulled out from under him. 12%, 30,000, zero respect. The math of a ruined life. Alex began to beg, his voice high-pitched and frantic. Please, if the Castigliones find out I'm short, if they find out about the loan reversal, the wedding is over. You can't do this to me, he was right. I was doing exactly that. I informed him that because I still held power of attorney over the house escrow, I had already frozen the accounts. The guarantee he had given the Conte was now legally void, a hollow promise backed by a frozen vault. I was no longer the safety net for a house of cards built on identity theft and parental manipulation. I didn't wait for his next lie or the inevitable explosion of grief. I pressed the end call button with a sharp, final click, cutting off the desperate sounds of Lake Como. I stood alone in the classroom, the vibration of the desk still humming in my palm. I knew that in Italy the music was about to stop. In Cleveland, my phone was already lighting up with a name from my past I hadn't seen in years. I didn't feel like a father, but for the first time in months, I felt like a man who finally knew his own value. The silence that follows a final goodbye to your own blood doesn't feel like peace. It feels like the air has been vacuumed out of the room, leaving only the smell of old chalk and regret. I sat motionless at my desk, the beige landline receiver still warm in my hand, despite the fact that the bridge to Italy was now a pile of smoldering digital ash. I had just ended the call with Alex, and the static from the transatlantic connection seemed to linger in the corners of my ears. My classroom, usually a sanctuary of logical proofs and predictable outcomes, felt different now. I looked at a student's incorrect derivation on a stack of ungraded quizzes and thought at least numbers have a rule for when they fail. They don't lie, they don't embezzle, and they certainly don't steal your father's soul for a deposit on a villa. My hands didn't shake, but I could hear my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I realized that Maggie Sterling had been watching me for weeks, and noticed the watch was missing long before I ever mentioned it, showing a level of quiet observation my own sons never possessed. It was a humbling realization that a colleague had read the subtraction of my dignity in the pale, bare strip of skin on my left wrist, while my children only looked at me to see what I could still add to their bank accounts. Kindness from a stranger is a surprise. Kindness from a peer is a mirror that shows you just how haggard you've actually become. A soft, rhythmic knock on the doorframe broke my trance. Maggie Sterling, the 57-year-old head of the science department, who had survived her own widowhood with quiet grace, knocked on my classroom door with 2 cups of coffee. She didn't ask if I was okay, a question that would only have forced me into the uncomfortable labor of a polite lie. Instead, she walked in the steam rising from the cardboard cups and set one on my scarred oak desk. She took a seat in a front-row student chair, her presence grounding the erratic energy of the room. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, catching the dust motes in the air, while the rough texture of the classroom carpet seemed to absorb the tension I had been carrying. "You have the look of a man who's been calculating the cost of a debt he didn't sign for Frank," she said softly. Her voice had a steady, melodic tone that made the heavy silence feel less like a vacuum and more like a conversation. Coffee? Black? No sugar? Just like the truth Maggie was about to pour out. She shared the story of her own husband's passing, telling me about the cheap $50 bracelet of tin and glass he had left her. "It holds more weight than the gold in a vault," she explained, "because he gave it to me when we had nothing but time." It was a lesson in emotional currency that I wasn't prepared for. I had spent my life thinking that providing the steel and the safe was the definition of fatherhood, but I was staring at a zero-sum game. However, the warmth of the coffee was quickly replaced by a cold spike of adrenaline. Maggie leaned in her voice, dropping to a teacher's whisper that signaled the end of the comfort. "Frank Alex didn't just call you. He called the district office asking about your pension status." She revealed that the principal had already received a confidential inquiry about my recent financial behavior. Alex wasn't just begging for a bailout anymore. He was moving from status-seeking to professional sabotage, attempting to audit my very life to see what he could still squeeze out of the remains. A son calling his father's employer to hunt for a pension isn't just a betrayal. It's an autopsy performed while the patient is still wide awake. I sat in the dimming light of my classroom, the dry, bitter taste of remaining coffee coating my tongue like a film of ash. Maggie's words about the district office didn't just break the silence. They shattered the last remaining pillar of my paternal delusion. I realized then that Alex wasn't just looking for wedding funds anymore. He was attempting to secure his inheritance before I even had the decency to die. He wanted to see if the vault was still warm, checking the structural integrity of my retirement plan with the cold eye of a scavenger. Then Maggie delivered the entry twist that made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. She revealed that Tyler was the one who had provided Alex with the specific internal contact numbers for the district office. My younger son, the quiet one, the one who had stood on my porch smelling of fear just days ago, was actively assisting in the financial hunt. They were working together now, a pair of vultures coordinating a strike on the living. Maggie watched me with a stillness that only someone who has survived a house fire can possess. "They don't see a father, Frank," she said, her voice cutting through the ticking of the institutional wall clock. "They see a retirement plan that's taking too long to mature." She began to tell me how her own son had tried to seize her home after her husband died filing papers, while the funeral flowers were still fresh. It was a mirror to my own nightmare, a reflection of a generational rot I had tried to ignore. When does a child stop being a blessing and start being a creditor? In my case, it was the moment I said no to a truffle dinner. I felt a cold clarity settling into my bones, replacing the frantic heat of indignation with a surgical distance. I was beginning to understand the math. If you stop giving and they stop calling, the equation is solved. They weren't in your life for the company, they were there for the dividends. Maggie stood up and walked toward the lounge area, the scent of stale microwave popcorn from the faculty room drifting in through the open door. We moved to the teacher's lounge, where the scratchy fabric of the old sofa felt like burlap against my skin. She wasn't just offering empathy, she was offering a sharp, clinical validation of my boundaries. "You aren't losing your children, Frank," she insisted. "You're losing users. You're losing people who loved you for what you could do, not who you are." I felt like a bridge that had been used for decades to cross a river, only to find the people on the other side were trying to sell my bricks. It was a brutal metaphor, but it fit the ledger of one-way transactions that had defined my relationship with my sons for far too long. Then Maggie revealed her final move. She wasn't just theorizing about social parasites. She had already contacted a lawyer friend specializing in elder law and asset protection. She was building a perimeter for me. Her hand covered mine, steady and warm, grounding me in the reality of the present. "Don't let them make you feel guilty for surviving the people you raised to eat you alive," she whispered. I looked at our hands and realized that for the first time in years, someone was holding on to me without asking for a signature on a check. The intruder didn't look like a threat. She looked like a walking advertisement for a life I had just decided I would no longer subsidize. As I pulled into my driveway, the hardened, analytically distant mood Maggie had instilled in me solidified into a cold wall of granite. A sleek black European SUV was idling in my spot, its engine a low, expensive thrum that vibrated through the steering wheel of my aging sedan. Sloane, a woman whose smile was as sharp and expensive as the designer sunglasses perched atop her head, stepped out of the SUV with the practiced grace of a debt collector in silk. She was in her early 30s, wrapped in high-end leisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. "Mr. Miller, I'm Sloane," she said, her voice a polished weapon. "I've seen your face in so many of Alex's childhood photos. It's a shame you're letting them gather dust while he's falling apart." The entry twist landed before she even reached my porch. She accidentally mentioned a project deadline at the firm, revealing she wasn't just a friend of the bride, but a junior partner at Alex's marketing agency. This wasn't a social visit. It was a corporate recovery mission for an investor in my son's fake persona. "If you're here for the business of my son's vanity, Sloane, you've traveled a long way for a closed account," I replied, stepping out of my car and meeting her gaze without blinking. We stood in the chill of the evening air, the smell of her expensive perfume clashing with the Cleveland exhaust. She followed me toward the porch, her heels clicking on the concrete with a rhythmic, irritating insistence. "Legacy. Legacy is what you leave behind when you're dead. I'm still breathing, and I'm taking mine back." Sloane didn't miss a beat, pivoting from faux warmth to a calculated pressure. She painted a vivid, hysterical picture of Isabella's aristocratic humiliation and Alex's impending social death among the Lake Como elite. She claimed I was single-handedly destroying a legacy. I ran my hand along the rough wood of the porch railing, feeling the grit under my fingers. "You're being cruel, Frank," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "Isabella is hysterical. The vendors are threatening to walk. This will destroy your family forever. Do these people realize that money doesn't just grow on trees? It grows on 60-hour work weeks and skipped vacations." I looked at her, seeing only the vacancy behind the designer lenses. "A villa doesn't make a marriage, Sloane. Tell them to find a judge and a $2 ring. Love doesn't need my house proceeds to be valid." She looked at me then, as if I were a difficult equation that refused to balance, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. Her voice rose, attracting the attention of a neighbor walking their dog. "You don't understand the world they live in. If this fails, Alex's reputation is gone." I didn't flinch. I let the silence of the street do the talking for me. As she realized the charm offensive had hit a dead end, She retreated toward her idling SUV, but not before launching a final, jagged threat. She screamed over the roof of the car that Signora Elena had already called a private investigator to look into my history, signaling that this war had escalated far beyond the confines of a bank account. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I stepped inside and slammed the door so hard, the glass rattled in its frame. But the silence that followed was immediately broken by the sharp, persistent chirp of a voicemail notification from my ex-wife. Hearing your ex-wife's voice after 5 years of static is like reopening a cold case file. You know there's no justice at the end, only more evidence of a shared failure. I stood in my dark hallway, the adrenaline from slamming the door on Sloane still thrumming in my fingertips, staring at the flashing red light on my landline base. The sharp, persistent chirp of the voicemail alert felt like a needle scratching at the silence of the house. I moved into the kitchen, the air smelling of the burnt toast I'd forgotten in the toaster earlier that morning, and reached for the cordless phone. The cold weight of the plastic felt uncomfortably heavy as I pressed play. Patricia, my ex-wife, whose voice still carried the sharp, Florida sunlight edge of a woman who had traded Cleveland gray for a life that didn't include me, sounded smaller than I had ever known her. Frank, pick up her voice, echoed, cracking with a frantic desperation. Alex says you've cut him off. He says you're letting him drown in Italy over a misunderstanding. He says you're being greedy because of some new girlfriend you're hiding. I looked at the receiver and wondered how many versions of the truth my son had authored this month. It was a classic Alex maneuver, a parallel psychological operation designed to weaponize our old resentments against one another for profit. Divorce is a wound that usually scabs over. Alex hadn't just picked at the scab. He'd performed a surgical strike on the scar tissue for profit. I dialed the Florida number, listening to the static on the long-distance line as it connected. When Patricia answered, the initial venom that usually defined our brief exchanges was absent, replaced by a ragged, hollow breathing. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. We dove straight into a clinical audit of our son's stories. As we began to compare the dates and the dollar amounts, the room seemed to grow colder. "Wait, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping into the precise tone I used for complex derivations. "You sent $15,000 for the florist on the 12th. I sent the exact same amount to the same account on the 14th. There was a long, terrible silence on her end. "He didn't just double-dip, Frank," she whispered. "He used our resentment of each other as a business model. We went down the list line by agonizing line, totaling the redundant funds we had both been manipulated into sending for the exact same emergency deposits. The math didn't lie even if our son did. $30,000. That's not a mistake. That's a heist." I sat down at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of the betrayal pressing against my chest, like a physical leaden sheet. Alex had played us like two opposing variables in a game he'd already rigged. He told Patricia I was a bitter, aging man obsessed with a fictional girlfriend, and he told me she was out of the picture and refusing to contribute a dime. But the final twist was the most devastating. Patricia admitted through her sobs that she didn't just empty her savings to fund the Italian dream Alex had sold her. She had taken out a second mortgage on her condo in Boca, $15,000, at 6.5% over 15 years. "Frank, if that money didn't go to the wedding, I'll be paying for his lie until I'm 73 years old." She was leveraged to the hilt for a wedding that was essentially a theatrical production of her own financial ruin. Patricia's sobbing breath hitched as she whispered, "Frank, if that money didn't go to the wedding, where is it?" And I knew the answer was sitting in a high-stakes account I was about to dismantle. I didn't have the heart to tell her about the watch yet. One audit at a time was all I could manage before the walls closed in. I didn't hesitate when I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the law office. I was moving with the momentum of a man who had finally stopped trying to balance an impossible equation. The crisp morning air of Cleveland clung to my coat, but inside the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old, leather-bound books and the quiet hum of high-stakes bureaucracy. Rebecca Winters, an attorney whose gray suit was as sharp as the legal mind that had dismantled some of Cleveland's messiest estates, looked at me with a professional's lack of judgment. As I sat across from her, she dropped a file onto the desk that contained the first entry twist of the afternoon. She informed me that Alex had already tried to contact her office weeks ago, masquerading as my representative to inquire about a premature inheritance transfer. My own son had been trying to rob me before the dirt was even dry on his wedding invitations. "I want them out, Rebecca," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the heat that usually accompanies such a statement. Not just the house proceeds, but the life insurance, the pension residuals, everything. I was essentially performing a clinical dissection of my own legacy, removing the cancerous elements to save the healthy tissue. Rebecca leaned back the scratch of her high-end fountain pen, pausing over a yellow legal pad. "Frank, this is a total disinheritance," she warned. "Once I file this, there's no going back without a complete mental competency review. Have you ever signed your own name and felt 20 pounds of guilt just vanish into the ink? It's a better high than any expensive wine in Lake Como." I watched the ink dry on the heavy legal bond paper, feeling the weight of 30 years of parental obligation finally lift from my shoulders. We spent the next hour reviewing the liquidation of the house proceeds, specifically earmarking the $158,000 for something that would actually honor my father's memory. I signed the documents to establish the Patrick Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, intended for first-generation working-class students from the same streets my father had walked. My father didn't work those double shifts at the Cleveland Steelworks, so his grandson could buy truffle oil and Italian approval. He worked for the future, and today I was finally putting that future into the right hands. Done, signed, sealed. The Miller boys were officially on their own. The finality of the act was a physical sensation, like a heavy vault door closing in the back of my mind. I left the office and walked down the street to a local diner, a place where the air was thick with the greasy, comforting smell of frying onions and strong coffee. I realized I hadn't eaten a full meal since Alex's email arrived, and for the first time in days, the thought of food didn't make me feel nauseated. "I'll take the classic burger," I told the waitress, "medium well, and keep the coffee coming." The meal didn't taste like ash. It tasted like victory. As I waited for my bill, I pulled my phone from my pocket and saw a bright, annoying flash on the screen. It was a notification from my bank. Alex had just attempted to log into my secondary retirement account from an IP address in Italy, triggering an immediate fraud alert. I looked at the alert and smiled. Alex was still digging, but he didn't realize the ground beneath him had already been excavated. He was trying to loot a tomb I had already emptied. Desperation has a frequency that pierces through the longest transatlantic cable, a high-pitched whine of a man who finally realizes the bank of unearned grace has permanently closed. The rainy Cleveland night hit the roof of my car with a hollow percussion as I drove back to my rental apartment. I was still riding the cold high of the fraud alert I'd received at the diner. Alex was still digging for a back door into my retirement accounts, but he didn't realize the ground beneath him had already been excavated. I stepped into my modest unit, the air smelling of damp concrete and autumn storm. Moving through the dark, I saw the blue glow of the answering machine pulsing like an accusing heartbeat. I pressed play, expecting a lawyer's update, but instead heard the tinny, distorted audio of my eldest son. It was a 3-minute rambling voicemail recorded from a cramped studio in Lake Como. "Dad." "The bank account." Alex started, his voice cracking. "It's frozen. I'm in a room the size of your pantry, and Isabella won't even look at me." In the background, I heard the distinct chirp of an Italian siren and the unmistakable jingle of a slot machine app. It was the entry twist that confirmed my worst fears. He was still gambling while begging for his life. "Do you hear that? That's the sound of a predator realizing he's been caught in a trap he set for someone else." I listened to the hollow echo and wondered if my son had ever truly been there at all. The opulence he tried to steal was gone, replaced by the reality of a man who traded his heritage for a life of mirrors. Alex's tone shifted from shock to a desperate attempt at manipulation. He invoked the memory of his mother, claiming she would be ashamed of my greed. "You're letting your own son rot in a foreign country over a watch, Frank. Think about what Mom would say." A surge of disgust settled in my chest. Mom would have been the one to change the locks, Alex, I thought, staring at the machine. You just never stayed around long enough to know her. He continued to weep, his voice a frantic thing, as he begged for a loan just to buy a plane ticket home. He admitted that Signora Elena had officially designated him American trash. For once, I found myself agreeing with the aristocratic woman. He had become exactly that, a disposable remnant of a life he never truly owned. American trash. He had traded 40 years of my father's steel for the approval of people who saw him as a temporary amusement. I stood in my silent living room shadows, long against the wall, watching him self-destruct in real time. Near the end of the message, Alex accidentally let the final truth slip. He admitted he had tried to sell Isabella's engagement ring to get the watch back from the loan shark, only to find out the stone was cubic zirconia, the final fraud in his own fake life. He had been cheated by the very vanity he sought to master. I didn't feel pity. I felt a clinical sense of completion. I didn't call him back, and I didn't save the recording for future leverage. I simply moved my finger to the console and felt the cold click of the delete button. I watched the digital evidence of my son's collapse vanish into a void, realizing that the only thing louder than his screaming was the peace I had finally found in the silence. I was still staring at the phone's keypad, my finger hovering over the ghost of my son's voice, when the screen lit up with an international number I didn't recognize. The kitchen was already bathed in the sharp, clinical light of the morning sun, cutting through the blinds, casting long, barred shadows across the granite counter. I had just deleted the evidence of Alex's moral collapse, but the silence that followed felt precarious. The phone began to vibrate, a rhythmic, insistent hum against the stone that sounded less like a call and more like a drum roll for a final execution. I looked at the Varese, Italy tag on the caller ID and felt a weary, familiar defensiveness rise in my chest. I wondered how many more ways they could ask for money I no longer had, or demand respect I no longer felt. I braced myself for another round of Alex's frantic manipulation, or perhaps a legal broadside from Signora Elena herself. Instead of a frantic pitch, the persistence of the vibration felt stately, a demand for attention that carried a different kind of gravity. I slid the bar to answer the feeling of the heavy kitchen stool solid under me as I prepared for a new front in the family war. Before I could speak, the first entry twist landed. The voice on the other end revealed that he had been the one to leak the pawn shop information to Tyler weeks ago. He had been hoping I would be the one to stop this wedding, before his own family's toxicity destroyed it completely. Conte Giovanni, a man whose voice carried the weight of centuries-old Italian stone and the soft, tragic cadence of someone who had watched his own family rot from the inside out, introduced himself with a gravelly, deep baritone. His English was broken, but his dignity was intact, a rare combination in a story currently populated by polished liars. "Signor Miller, please," he said, his voice cutting through the transatlantic static. "I do not call for the bank accounts. I call because I have seen the face of a man who values his father's memory more than a villa's approval." The sound of his breath was heavy with a profound, quiet exhaustion. I sat there, the scent of cold coffee grounds from the morning's brew lingering in the air, stunned by the sudden shift in the narrative. "You are the first person from that side of the ocean to speak to me like a man, Conte, and not a cash register," I replied. It was a moment of cross-cultural parental solidarity I hadn't seen coming. We were just two men sitting in different time zones, both sifting through the wreckage of legacies we had tried to protect. His tone shifted, then dropping into a register of stark, unvarnished truth. Bankrupt. Not just in spirit. In the literal, cold, hard cash sense of the word. He admitted that Signora Elena had been carefully hiding the fact that her textile empire was currently in receivership. Alex hadn't been marrying into a dynasty. He had been clawing his way into a sinking ship of bankrupt pride. The irony was almost mathematical in its cruelty. Alex had sold my father's steel to buy a seat at a table that was already being repossessed. The aristocratic dream he'd leveraged his soul for was nothing more than a hollow shell. Giovanni let out a long, shuddering breath that vibrated through the receiver, the sound of a man finally dropping a burden he couldn't carry. "Signor Miller, I have something to tell you about the watch Alex sold. It did not end up where he thinks it did." I gripped the phone tighter, my heart knocking against my ribs as the air in the kitchen suddenly felt too still. This call from the Conte came on Saturday, October 4th, 2025, 3 days after the wedding collapsed, and what he told me next would change everything. There is a profound, icy justice in learning that the weapon your son tried to use to bury you has actually become the shovel for his own social grave. I sat in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, listening as the Conte's voice dropped an octave to describe the ultimate failure of Alex's masquerade. The news hit me with the force of a tidal wave, but instead of drowning, I felt like I was finally surfacing. Frank learns that the Conte has already initiated an annulment process for Isabella, meaning Alex's play for old money status lasted less than 72 hours. He had sold his soul for a kingdom that had dissolved before the honeymoon could even begin. Giovanni's revelation about the watch was the killing blow. He told me that when Alex pawned the Omega Seamaster, the shopkeeper, a distant cousin of the Contes, recognized the Sullivan name from the wedding guest list. Instead of letting it sit in a dusty window, the Conte quietly bought the watch himself. Alex thinks his secret is safe with a stranger, Signor Miller. Giovanni said, his voice weary but firm. He does not realize I am wearing his grandfather's life on my wrist as I speak. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, my knuckles turning white. "You kept it," I whispered, the awe thick in my throat. "You didn't just let it vanish." No, he replied. "I keep it as penance for the shame my own wife brought upon us. I will return it to you, Frank. It is not mine to hold." Have you ever seen a man try to dance in a burning room while insisting he's at a ball that was my son in Italy? The Conte described the Wednesday, October 1st, 2025 ceremony with a grim, clinical detail. With the funds frozen and the aristocratic illusion shattered, the villa management moved the event to a cramped side chapel. There were no truffles, no vintage Brunello, and certainly no dignity. The flowers were wilted grocery store carnations, and the catering was replaced by local supermarket trays of cold pasta and lasagna. I could almost smell the scent of old pasta water in the air as Giovanni spoke. Signora Elena's friends didn't even hide their sneers, leaving Alex and Isabella in a social vacuum. They ate frozen pasta while my son tried to act like he was still a king, Giovanni noted. I stared out at the gray Cleveland morning, a cold sweat on my palms. I hoped the truffle dinner was worth the grocery store wedding, Alex, I thought, feeling a dark, satisfied clarity. The math had finally balanced, and the remainder was 0. I thanked the Conte and ended the call, the silence of the kitchen punctuated only by the metallic hum of my laptop fan. I opened the browser, my fingers steady as I navigated to a luxury travel site. Click. Confirm. Paid in full. My own life was finally beginning. I discovered that the solo Mediterranean cruise I was booking fell on the exact same dates and in the same region as Alex's planned honeymoon, except I would be staying in the royal suite. He could never afford. As the bright blue confirmation screen lit up my face, a confirmation email hit my inbox. I felt a surge of liberation, a quiet triumph that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with survival. But that peace was short-lived. My doorbell suddenly rang with a heavy, insistent thud that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the polite chime of a guest. It was the rhythmic, demanding pounding of someone who had come to collect. Tyler's creditors had finally found my address, and they weren't interested in a live stream. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the logic of a man who had already balanced his own books and found my son's debts were no longer my variables to solve. The heavy thudding on the door continued a rhythmic, violent demand that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. I walked toward the entrance with the steady, measured pace of a man heading to a blackboard to correct a student's sloppy arithmetic. I had already booked my flight to the Mediterranean, and I wasn't about to let a ghost from Tyler's gambling habit haunt my hallway. I pulled the door open, the yellow glow of the porch light reflecting off the shaved head of the man standing there. Vic, a man who possessed the facial expression of a landslide and a suit that struggled to contain the violent potential of his shoulders, stood on my porch like a tax collector for the damned. He smelled of stale tobacco and cheap cologne, a scent that cloyed in the crisp evening air. "You the father?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Tyler said you were the bank, said the Italy wedding was a guaranteed payout." I stood my ground, the gritty feeling of the concrete under my feet keeping me anchored. "Tyler Miller is an adult who makes his own wagers." "Vic," I replied, my voice as flat as a desert horizon, "if you're looking for the bank, you're about 3,000 miles and one frozen account too late. Do you know what a cinderblock thinks about nothing?" And that was exactly how much I cared about Vic's threats. He shifted his weight, the leather of his jacket creaking as he looked past me into the house. He began to talk about the fragility of windows and the permanence of pension plans if things didn't get settled. It was a practiced intimidation, but it lacked the cold precision of the entry twist he delivered next. Vic revealed that Tyler had actually tried to sign my car title over to his bookies as collateral while I was at work last week. The only reason I was still driving it was because the notary had realized the signature was a clumsy forgery. The betrayal was absolute, a final confirmation that Tyler was willing to liquidate my very mobility to cover a bad hand. I looked at Vic, refusing to swallow the metallic taste of fear that he was trying to force down my throat. "If you want blood, Vic, you're squeezing a stone. I've already liquidated my assets for a scholarship fund. You have no leverage here." Latte art. That was Tyler's new career, and his only chance at survival. I didn't cower. Instead, I leaned in slightly, making sure my eyes were visible in the porch light. "If you want Tyler, he's at the Brew and Bean on 4th, I said. "He starts his shift at 5 a.m. I'm not my son's keeper anymore. I'm just a man who knows where the baristas are buried." Then I delivered the final variable to his equation. I pointed a steady finger toward the small black dome above the doorframe. "I've recorded this entire interaction on my doorbell camera and sent the feed to my lawyer, Rebecca. Any accidents to this house will result in an immediate criminal RICO investigation." Vic looked at the camera, then back at me, his eyes narrowing as he realized I was a different breed of target than my son. Just then, a sharp notification chirped on my phone. I pulled it out to see an alert about a confidential school board meeting scheduled for Monday. The war wasn't over. It was just moving to a different classroom. The smell of fear is indistinguishable from the smell of old coffee and unwashed clothes when your own son stands in your living room begging for a price tag on his survival. I sat in the high-backed armchair, my eyes fixed on the driveway, as Tyler's beat-up sedan rattled to a halt. My mind was still occupied by the digital vibration of the school board notification on my phone, but the physical reality of the mess I had raised was now crossing my threshold. Tyler Miller entered the house looking like a man who had been dismantled by a week of avoiding eye contact with his own shadow. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask how I was. He simply collapsed onto the sofa, his shoulders hunched, radiating a frantic energy that made the air in the room feel thin and stale. "Dad, you don't understand." He started, his voice a ragged whisper. "Vic isn't a bank. He doesn't send late notices. He sends people." I watched him with the detached interest of a biologist observing a dying specimen. I already knew the entry twist that he thought was a secret. I knew he hadn't just known about the theft of my father's watch. He had been the one to drive a drunk Alex to the pawn shop because Alex couldn't navigate West 25th Street. I understand perfectly, Tyler, I replied. You gambled with the house's money and now the house wants its cut. I remained standing, my finger tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the back of the mahogany chair. The morning light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air between us, highlighting the oily sheen of sweat on Tyler's face. He launched into a rehearsed plea for a bridge loan, blaming Alex for forcing him into silence in exchange for a payout. Do you know what the interest rate is on a father's broken trust? It's infinite. And Tyler was trying to pay it off with copper pennies. He spoke about his debts as if they were a natural disaster that had befallen him, rather than a series of deliberate wagers. You knew about the Omega the night it left the safe. I interrupted, my voice cutting through his stammering. You watched me wind air for a week and said nothing because you thought a truffle dinner would pay your poker debts. He flinched as if I'd struck him, but the excuses kept coming. I was going to pay you back? Frank every cent. I looked at him and saw the vacancy where a conscience should have been. A maybe. He gambled my father's life on a maybe. The math was offensive. Shame is a weight some men can't carry, so they try to sell the floor beneath them instead. Tyler's desperation took a turn for the pathetic as he revealed his latest attempt at a score. He admitted he had tried to sell my teacher's retirement plaque on eBay last night, but the auction had been flagged because my name is too well known in the local school community. He was trying to liquidate my honors to pay for his failures. I felt a cold, hard finality settling in my gut, a clinical resolve to stop the bleeding. Tyler's face drained of color, his knees knocking together under his frayed jeans. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a document, the paper crinkling in his shaking hand. If you don't help me, they're going to take the car, and I told them you'd sign the title today, he whispered. I looked at the cold weight of the car title and realized the basement was even deeper than I thought. He hadn't just come for a loan. He had already sold the ground I was standing on. The blue light of a laptop screen is a cold, honest witness. It doesn't flinch when it reveals that the boy you raised has been bartering your soul in digital chat rooms for months. After Tyler scrambled out of my driveway, leaving the scent of stale cigarettes and desperation hanging in the air, I sat at my desk and opened the lid of my laptop. I'm a man of variables and constants, and Tyler had become a variable that refused to resolve. I began to dig into his digital footprint with a surgical focus, my eyes reflecting the harsh glow of the monitor as the fan began a low, rhythmic hum. It didn't take long to find him. Under the username ClevelandTie29, my younger son had been a frequent flyer on a high-stakes underground poker forum since July 2025. I scrolled through months of posts watching him spin a narrative of an impending windfall from a rich brother's aristocratic wedding. The calculated nature of the entries was devastating. On July 14th, while I was taking him out for his birthday dinner, he was online telling strangers I was his exit strategy. I felt a cold, analytical horror as I realized he wasn't just a victim of a bad streak. He was a predator who had been circling my assets for a fiscal quarter. The entry twist was the most jagged pill to swallow. Tyler had used my identity to co-sign a digital credit line on the gambling site, legally tethering my credit score to his addiction. Every pixel was a piece of the man I thought I raised, dissolving in real time. I began taking screenshots, my mouse clicking with a dry mechanical finality. I focused on a specific thread where Tyler explicitly detailed the house sale escrow and bragged about having the safe code. The silent fee Alex had paid him wasn't an endpoint. It was just a down payment on a much larger betrayal. July 14th. A birthday cake and a betrayal. The math of a monster. I compiled the evidence into a folder, the smell of ozone and old electronics, filling the small room as the processor worked. Do you still believe in the innocent younger brother? Because I was looking at a digital paper trail that said otherwise. I was ready to drop the truth. I hit send on the email to Tyler with a subject line that simply read, "I know everything." Within seconds, the phone on my wooden desk began to vibrate. Tyler's name dancing across the screen in a rhythmic, frantic plea. I rejected the call instantly. "I am not your safety net, Tyler. I am your auditor," texts Tyler. "Saw you at work. Proud of you for trying. Keep that $500 per month pace. You'll be clear in 8 years. You can do it." The phone stopped vibrating, leaving a silence that finally felt like clean air. I watched the read receipt appear on my message, but my satisfaction was cut short by a notification from Alex, a public social media post that had already been shared 500 times. I realized the confidential school board meeting alert was a tip from Tyler, a desperate move to freeze my pension and force a settlement. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the boardroom's glass doors, realizing that after 35 years of teaching morality, I was finally the one on the witness stand. The blinding white background of Alex's Facebook post, showing a grainy photo of me looking red-faced and angry at a past Thanksgiving dinner, had been the catalyst for this early morning summons. I pushed open the doors and stepped into a space that smelled of lemon floor wax and impending judgment. The board president, a man whose skin was the color of old parchment and whose eyes held the weary skepticism of a career bureaucrat, peered at me over his bifocals. I sat at the center of the cold, grain mahogany table facing a 5-member panel in a closed session. Before the first question was even asked, the entry twist arrived in the form of a metadata report on the anonymous pension tip I'd received. It hadn't come from a concerned citizen, but from a device registered to the Brew and Bean coffee shop where Tyler worked. My younger son wasn't just a gambler. He was an active saboteur attempting to freeze my livelihood to force a settlement. "Mr. Miller," the president began gesturing toward the bright white glare of a tablet screen. "This social media post paints a picture of a man who has lost control of his faculties. Is there any truth to these claims of mental instability?" I leaned forward, the hum of the overhead vents filling the silence of the sterile room. "I have spent my life calculating limits," I said, my voice steady enough to bridge a canyon. "The only thing I've lost control of, President, is my willingness to be a silent bank account for a liar." A boardroom is a lot like a petri dish. You don't know which way the bacteria will grow until you drop in a little bit of truth. The panel exchanged uneasy glances, but they were bound by the formality of the complaint filed by one of Alex's marketing colleagues. Just as the momentum seemed to lean toward a precautionary suspension, the door opened. Maggie Sterling walked in, carrying a folder with the posture of a woman who had already solved the proof. She didn't just offer platitudes. She laid out the pawnshop receipts and the digital fraud alerts Alex had triggered while trying to hack my accounts. "Frank Miller is the most mathematically consistent man I know," she told them, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "These aren't the actions of an unstable man. They are the actions of a father who refused to fund his own erasure. Look at the timestamps, gentlemen. The attack on his job began only after the check for the villa was canceled. Dismissed. The word didn't just end the meeting. It ended the hold my sons had on my future." The final twist of the morning came as the board secretary mentioned that the original complainant was currently under federal investigation for corporate embezzlement, rendering their character assassination attempt legally radioactive. The sound of the gavel striking wood was the sweetest note I'd heard in decades. I felt a profound surge of gratitude toward Maggie, a debt that couldn't be quantified in dollars. We walked out of the building together, the crisp morning air finally feeling clean. I pulled up the social media post one last time, scrolling past the 500 shares of my supposed madness. I realized Alex had finally made a fatal error in his vanity. He had tagged Senora Elena in the comments to prove his loyalty to her brand. He was trying to burn me down to stay warm in her shadow, not knowing that I was about to pour the fuel. 1 week after the wedding, Thursday, October 8th, 2025, digital lies travel halfway around the world before the truth has even finished its first cup of coffee. But I was about to give the truth a high-octane wake-up call I sat in the passenger seat of my car, the blue glow of my smartphone illuminating the cabin in the otherwise dark parking lot. Beside me, Maggie Sterling watched with a quiet, supportive intensity, the scent of her perfume and the cool night air mixing in the cramped space. We had just walked out of the school board office, but the war was still raging on the glass screen in my palm. Alex's public post was a masterpiece of manufactured tragedy. He had painted me as a monster who abandoned his only son on his wedding day, out of sheer unadulterated spite. The comments were a feeding frenzy. Hundreds of strangers were calling for my head, and Sloan was leading the charge, demanding a district-wide boycott. Then the first entry twist hit me like a physical jolt. I scrolled through the names on the like list and saw Tyler's face. My younger son hadn't just remained silent. He had liked every single comment calling for my termination. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a participant in my professional autopsy. He's not just lying to the public. Maggie, I said, my thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard. He's auditioning for a role in a family that's already evicted him. By tagging Senora Elena, he's desperately trying to prove that I'm the sole cause of their financial ruin, not his own incompetence. I began to type, treating the rebuttal with the same surgical precision I would apply to a geometric proof. Do you know what happens when you treat your father like a line item? You eventually find out that line items can be deleted. I didn't trade insults or indulge in a public tantrum. Instead, I audited him. I listed the hard data. The theft of the 1982 Omega Seamaster, the $30,000 of double-dipped fraud, confirmed by his mother, and the high-definition Livestream uninvitation. I attached the digital receipt from the pawn shop that Conte Giovanni had sent me, a physical proof of the betrayal that Alex thought was buried in a Lake Como ledger. I'm not going to argue with him, Maggie. I'm going to audit him. Let the world see the exact price of a truffle dinner in Lake Como. Audit, not argument. Truth, not tantrum. Post. My thumbs moved with a steady rhythmic tapping, drafting the final lines of the response. I felt a sense of calculated retribution, an empowerment that came from finally refusing to be the silent denominator in their fraudulent equations. Just as my finger hovered over the blue button, the phone vibrated in my hand, a direct message from Isabella. She was pleading with me to stop. She claimed Senora Elena would disown her if this American scandal became public, begging me to protect her family's bankrupt pride at the cost of my own dignity. I looked at the message, then at Maggie, who simply nodded once. The math was simple. If I protected their lie, I remained a villain in my own life. I ignored Isabella's desperate plea and watched the post button turn gray, the haptic vibration signaling the comment was live. I knew that in exactly 3 seconds, the aristocratic life Alex had built on my back was going to shatter into a million public pieces. I leaned back and watched the screen, waiting for the first wave of the reaction to hit. I watched the delete icon flash on Alex's profile page as he tried to scrub the truth from the internet. But the digital stains I'd left were already permanent. It was the afternoon after the social media explosion, and I was sitting in my classroom at Lincoln High, the golden sun hitting the chalkboard in long, warm diagonals. Maggie Sterling sat across from me, the comforting smell of her vanilla tea cutting through the usual scent of floor wax and old paper. We were reviewing the wreckage. Alex's post, once a beacon of unearned sympathy, had been wiped clean after nearly 1,000 comments turned the tide against him. The public didn't want a tragic son. They wanted to know why he'd pawned his grandfather's watch for a truffle dinner. He thought the internet was his stage, Maggie, I said, leaning back in my chair. He forgot it's also a courthouse. Maggie laughed, a soft, melodic sound that felt like a reward. You didn't just defend yourself, Frank. You gave a masterclass in self-respect. To my surprise, she then confessed that she had already looked up the cruise itinerary the night before, admitting she had been quietly hoping I would find the courage to ask her along. I felt an uncharacteristic surge of bravery a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the setting sun. I've spent 60 years waiting for someone else to give me permission to live. I told her, my voice more certain than it had been in decades. I'm done waiting. Would you like to see Greece with me, Maggie? I watched her eyes light up, reflecting the golden hour. Asking a woman to cross an ocean with you is a lot like introducing a new theorem to a skeptical class. You have to hope the logic is sound enough to overcome the fear of the unknown. I offered the autonomy of an adjoining cabin, a safeguard for her privacy and my own nerves. Adjoining rooms, Frank, she teased, her smile widening. You really are a man of variables and safeguards. I smiled back, the soft click of my laptop mouse echoing in the quiet room as I prepared to change the reservation from 1 to 2, Santorini. The word sounded like a prayer, or a promise. As I navigated the booking site, I stumbled upon a detail I had overlooked in my previous haste. By booking for 2, I actually qualified for a legacy discount through a teachers' union travel perk I had ignored for years. It was a minor fiscal victory, but in a life recently defined by major losses, it felt like a cosmic nod of approval. Done. Confirmed. The bright blue screen glowed with our names side by side. For a moment, the Cleveland gray outside the window seemed to dissolve, entirely replaced by the imagined blue roofs of the Mediterranean. Maggie's hand brushed mine as she stood up, a genuine warm expression on her face. It's a date, she said softly. The moment of peace was shattered by the annoying rhythmic buzz of my smartphone against the wooden desk. I looked down to see a series of hysterical, incoherent texts from Tyler. His car had been repossessed in the coffee shop parking lot, and he was currently stranded, begging for a rescue I had no intention of providing. I ignored the notification, letting the screen go dark, and chose instead to focus on the woman standing in front of me. The desperation of a gambler who has run out of collateral doesn't sound like a tragedy. It sounds like the high-pitched whine of a machine that finally stripped its gears. I stood in my hallway, the biting chill of a Cleveland draft snaking under the front door and biting at my ankles, while the phone in my hand vibrated with the kinetic energy of Tyler's total collapse. The Greek dreams I'd been sharing with Maggie felt a world away as I pressed the receiver to my ear. I didn't say hello. I simply waited. The sound of muffled traffic and the sharp, distant hiss of air brakes filled the line before Tyler finally spoke, his voice cracking into a sob. "Dad, they just hooked it," he gasped. "Right in front of the shop." I have nothing left to get to work. I closed my eyes, picturing the yellow hue of a street lamp illuminating the empty space where his sedan used to be. He explained that because I hadn't signed the title over to Vic, the dealer's secondary tracker had led the repo man straight to his place of business. Then came the entry twist that turned my pity into a cold, hard knot of disgust. Tyler admitted he had hidden a spare key to my own car in his pocket for weeks, planning to take it the moment his own situation became untenable. He was begging for my mercy, but he was still holding a thief's intent. I sat on the edge of my bed, the smell of wool and mothballs rising from my winter coat, as I prepared to pack it away for good. "You have the same thing everyone else in this city has, Tyler," I said, my voice as flat as a horizon line. 2 feet and a bus schedule. He let out a wail that sounded more like a wounded animal than a 29-year-old man. "It's freezing out here, Frank. You're really going to make me walk in the dark. Do you know what the temperature of self-respect is? It's about 32 degrees, the exact point where you stop caring if your son's ears are cold." I systematically rejected every piece of emotional blackmail he threw at me. I reminded him that the very car he wanted to borrow was part of the assets being liquidated to fund the Sullivan Scholarship. I was no longer the logistics manager for his disasters. "The dark is where you've been living for months, Tyler," I added. "At least now you'll be getting some exercise while you're there." A walk in the November cold was the only curriculum left that might teach him the weight of the variables he'd so carelessly tossed aside. Walk, reflect, repeat. The curriculum of the real world. I listened to his stuttering excuses, the frantic entitlement of a boy who believed the world owed him a soft landing. He tried to claim his survival depended on my sedan, but the math didn't add up. Survival depends on integrity, not a combustion engine. Just before he could launch into another round of begging, I delivered the final blow to his plan. I informed Tyler that I had already changed the ignition cylinders on my car yesterday afternoon because I had anticipated exactly this move. I knew he had a key, and I'd already solved for that variable before he even knew the equation had changed. I felt a clinical sense of resolution as the line went silent on his end. The tactile click of the end call button was the most final thing I'd done all year. I hung up on his silence and went back to my packing list for Greece, realizing that the only thing colder than the Cleveland wind was the silence of a father who had finally stopped being a victim. It was time to find the watch. The bell above the door chimed with a tinny, desperate sound, the kind of noise that usually signals the end of someone's luck. But for me, it was just the start of an audit. I stepped into Gold and Grace Pawn on West 25th Street, leaving the muffled roar of Cleveland traffic behind. The air inside was thick and stagnant, smelling of stale smoke and old metal. I approached the plexiglass counter, my eyes scanning the cluttered shelves behind the yellowed light of the display cases. Bernie, a man whose skin looked like a cured ham, and whose eyes were perpetually calculating the scrap value of everything in the room, didn't bother looking up from his tabloid. "I'm not here to browse, Bernie," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. "I'm here for a watch that shouldn't have been in your window in the first place." I presented the pawn ticket information Tyler had dropped. Bernie let out a dry, rattling cough and finally met my gaze. "Look, pal, the ticket says it was a voluntary transaction. I don't police family squabbles." He then dropped a detail that felt like a jagged blade. Alex had told him the watch was an inheritance he received early because I was no longer of sound mind. My own son had used defamation as a lubricant for his theft. A pawn shop is a museum of failures, each tag a miniature tombstone for an object that used to mean something to someone. I felt the cold, greasy texture of the plexiglass under my fingers as Bernie finally pulled a heavy ledger from beneath the counter. I wasn't just looking for steel. I was looking for the last physical anchor of my father's 40 years at the mill. I felt a clinical coldness settling over me, a simmering tension that made my fingers itch to reach through the glass. Bernie flipped through the pages and stopped tapping a grimy finger on a line of ink. "It's gone, Frank," he said, his voice devoid of empathy. "Private collector. Wired the money from Varese before the ink on the tag was even dry." He explained that a high-end buyer from overseas had contacted him shortly after the watch was displayed, paying a premium to have it shipped immediately. Varese. The name sounded like a door slamming shut in a very large, very expensive house. Of course, it wasn't just a theft. It was a liquidation. I stood there staring at the empty spot where I imagined the Omega had rested. But then a strange power reversal happened in my mind. I realized I didn't actually want the watch back if it meant being tethered to the trauma of the theft. I preferred it remain with the Conte as a symbol of the honor my sons lacked. I exited the shop empty-handed, but strangely at peace, the physical link severed, but the legacy preserved in a way Alex would never understand. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a notification from the scholarship fund. The first applicant had just submitted their essay, and the name at the top made my breath hitch. Stepping into a home where the air doesn't vibrate with hidden agendas is like finally being allowed to breathe after a lifetime underwater. I arrived at Maggie's house for dinner, the soft blue glow of the scholarship portal still shimmering in my mind like a promise. I was introduced to David Sterling, Maggie's son, who had his mother's observant eyes and a firm handshake that spoke of a man who worked for a living rather than bartering for a lifestyle. Then there was Sarah Sterling, who greeted me with a smile bright enough to cut through the November chill, her energy a stark contrast to the hollow vanity I'd come to expect from the younger generation. I found myself waiting for the transactional tension the moment where David or Sarah would ask about my pension or my equity. Instead, they asked about my favorite books and why I still loved teaching calculus after 35 years. Mom told us, "You're the reason the scores at Lincoln are respectable, mister," Miller David said with genuine warmth. I realized I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but in this house everyone just left their shoes at the door. I discovered that the brilliant scholarship applicant, whose name had stunned me earlier, was actually a student Sarah had mentored a kid from the same steel mill background as my father. A healthy family is like a well-balanced equation. The variables might change, but the equal sign always remains in the center. I sat at their dining table, the smell of ginger and sesame oil filling the room, and watched a dynamic I hadn't known was possible. There was no manipulative guilt, no double-dipping for cash, and no bargaining for affection. I felt the warmth of the radiator against my back and the solid texture of a handmade ceramic plate in my hands. Before I described the moment, the contrast between our families became undeniable. Are you still watching this unfold with me? Comment A if you think integrity is born, or B if it's taught, and add one short reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. If you'd rather not continue, feel free to click away now. Pot stickers, not truffles. Respect, not ransom. During dinner, the conversation flowed with an effortless grace that made my heart ache for what I had never had with Alex and Tyler. "We don't need a villa in Como," Maggie joked as she passed a platter. "We have a porch in Cleveland and the best pot stickers in the county." The laughter that followed was genuine, a sound that didn't require a down payment. I looked at David and Sarah and realized the math of their family was addition, while mine had been a long, slow process of subtraction. Then Maggie revealed the final twist. Her children were the ones who had encouraged her to ask me on the cruise. They wanted her to be happy, even if it meant she spent her time and money on herself. It was a character exposure that left me speechless. As I walked to my car in the cold Cleveland night, the realization hit me with the force of a fundamental law. My son's failure wasn't my fault, but their choice. I didn't feel like a father who had failed. I felt like a man who had finally graduated from a class he never should have been forced to take. The equation of my life had finally balanced, and for the first time, the result was a surplus. There is a specific kind of cruelty in forgiveness. It doesn't offer a bridge back. It simply removes the weight of the anger so you can walk away faster. I was standing in my bedroom, the air smelling of rain and departure, as I folded the last of my linen shirts into my suitcase. The hum of the jet engine and the Atlantic Ocean already felt like they were calling to me, a clean slate, stretching toward a horizon I hadn't seen in years. My phone vibrated against the cold wood of my dresser, Alex's international number again. I didn't answer out of obligation, but for the clinical necessity of a closing statement. He didn't sound like the aristocratic groom anymore. He sounded hollow, speaking over the distant, echoing announcements of the Milan train station. "They took the suit, Dad." He whispered, his voice cracking. "The one you paid for." I'm sitting on a wooden bench in Milan wearing a gym sweatshirt. He had been formally evicted from the Castiglione estate, a social pariah, in a country that had no more use for his lies. "I didn't pay for the suit, Alex," I replied, my voice as flat as a horizon line. "I paid for the lesson. It looks like you're finally attending class." He then revealed the entry twist. Tyler had already blocked his number and refused to help. Their predatory alliance had dissolved the moment the bank account hit zero. Forgiveness is the zero in a complex equation. It doesn't change the value of the other numbers, it just makes the whole problem disappear. I watched the dust motes dance in the light of the empty room, feeling a sense of pity that carried absolutely no responsibility. Alex began to beg, his words tripping over each other as he asked for a mercy wire just to get to a hostel. He spoke of hunger and isolation, but I remained surgically calm. I took a deep breath, the cold plastic of the smartphone smooth against my ear. I forgive you, Alex. Truly. And because I forgive you, I don't have to carry your failures anymore. You are a free man, and so am I. You're just going to leave me here. With nothing, he gasped. Nothing. It was the only thing I had left to give him, and it was exactly what he had earned. I informed him that the Patrick Sullivan Memorial Scholarship was already fully funded, and that the first recipient was a brilliant student from his own old middle school, a kid who actually understood the value of $1 and the weight of a legacy. I was essentially replacing Alex's spot in our history with someone who deserved it. The silence on the other end of the line was the most honest thing he had ever given me. I didn't wait for him to find a new lie or a new angle of attack. I simply pressed the end call button for the last time, the metallic hum of my suitcase wheels, providing the only soundtrack as I walked out of the room. I passed the empty red velvet box on my way out, a hollow ghost of a stolen past, and didn't even look back. The rhythmic thud of the front door locking echoed through the hallway, marking the official end of the Miller family debt. I walked toward the airport, finally light enough to fly. The smell of floor wax and teenage anxiety has been my oxygen for 35 years, but today, the air in this auditorium finally feels like it belongs to someone else. I stood in the wings of the Lincoln High Auditorium, the squeak of floorboards under my feet, sounding like a final roll call. I looked out from behind the heavy velvet curtain at the sea of faces, students, faculty, and alumni who had heard the rumors. Even the board members who had tried to suspend me were there, forced to sit in the front row and smile for the local news cameras, because the story of the teacher who chose his legacy over his predatory sons had gone viral. They didn't come to see a man retire. They came to see a man who refused to be liquidated. Maggie gave me a thumbs up from the front row, her eyes shining with a pride my own family never possessed. Just as I prepared to step out, the first entry twist played out in the back of the room. The concerned citizen who had tried to have me fired was being quietly escorted out by security. The power reversal was absolute. If you subtract 35 years of service from a man's life, what's left? If you're lucky, it's a room full of people who finally know how to calculate their own worth. I walked to the lectern, the blinding heat of the stage lights making me squint. The smell of old velvet and dust was thick, a familiar comfort as I faced the crowd. I had spent my career teaching variables and constants, but today I was here to talk about the calculus of character. Before I deliver the speech that officially redirects my father's life work into a future my sons tried to steal. Are you still watching this unfold with me? Comment 5 if you think legacy is blood, or 10 if it's impact, and add one short reason. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the core message. If you're not comfortable with dramatized details, you can stop the video here. I took a deep breath, my fingers gripping the wood of the podium. In mathematics, we look for the simplest solution. I began, my voice echoing with a clarity that surprised me. In life, the simplest solution is often the hardest, standing your ground when the people you love try to move the decimal point on your soul. I publicly announced the Patrick Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, $5,000 per year for 4 years, renewable. For first-generation working-class students pursuing mechanical engineering or skilled trades, specifically explaining that it was funded by the $158,000 equity of a house that was meant to be a home, but became a transaction. Legacy, not greed. Character, not truffles. I was done with the lies. As a final note, I revealed the identity of the first recipient, a brilliant young man who was the son of one of my father's old co-workers from the steelworks, closing a 40-year-old loop of steel and sweat. The thunderous sound of 1,000 people clapping rose up to meet me, a wave of sound that felt more like a family than anything I had known in years. I left my office keys on the lectern, their cold weight no longer my burden to carry. As I stepped off the podium, I felt my pocket vibrate, a text from an unknown number with a photo of a familiar red velvet box sitting on a polished wooden table in Lake Como. The watch wasn't gone. It was just waiting for me to arrive. Emptying a house where you raised ghosts is less like moving and more like performing a slow, methodical exorcism with cardboard boxes and a roll of heavy-duty tape. I stood in the silent hallway of my Cleveland home, the floorboards groaning under the weight of my final walkthrough. Only 2 days had passed since I stepped off that auditorium stage, but the vibrant energy of the standing ovation felt like a distant memory compared to the dusty, dry smell of old attics that now filled my lungs. I entered Tyler's old bedroom, intending to do a final sweep, when I found the entry twist I should have seen years ago. Tucked behind a loose baseboard was a hidden stash of pawn tickets, dating back to his high school years. The gambling wasn't a recent lapse in judgment. It was a lifelong habit I had been willfully blind to. I had been subsidizing his slow-motion car crash for over a decade without ever looking at the skid marks. I moved to my home office where the screech of packing tape echoed through the hollow rooms. I looked at the stacks of report cards, soccer trophies, and graduation photos. I used to think these trophies were a down payment on their character. I was just buying expensive dust. I fed the paper shadows into the shredder, the machine humming a funeral march for the versions of them I once loved. A home is just an expensive locker for the things you aren't ready to lose yet. Today, I was ready to lose everything. The mathematical precision I had applied to calculus for 35 years was now being applied to the remnants of my life. I walked into the master bedroom, my single suitcase feeling light in my hand. Trophies, shredded, safe, open, done. I stood before the master safe, the very vault that Alex and Tyler had treated like a treasure map. I didn't just lock it. I removed the digital keypad entirely and left the heavy steel door hanging open for the next owners. A safe is only as valuable as the integrity of the people who have the code. This one is just a hollow box now. I picked up the empty red velvet box, the one that had once held my father's 1982 Omega Seamaster, and dropped it into a donation bin. I wasn't throwing away my father's memory. I was throwing away the bait my sons used to fish for my soul. My phone buzzed. It was my realtor informing me that a private party had made an all-cash offer above asking price. The twist was the condition I had to leave absolutely nothing behind. No memories, no ghosts. It was the easiest term I'd ever had to meet. I pulled the front door shut and turned the key one last time, the cold bite of the Cleveland wind hitting my face. As I walked toward my car, a courier pulled up with a package that required a signature from the estate of Patrick Sullivan. I didn't open the box in the car. I waited until the Cleveland skyline was a gray smudge in my rearview mirror, a ghost of a life I'd finally stopped haunting. I felt the tactile resistance of the courier's electronic clipboard as I signed my name for the last time in that city, my hand steady despite the bitter wind. The package was heavier than it looked, addressed to the estate of Patrick Sullivan. The entry twist was revealed as I inspected the shipping manifest. The courier hadn't been sent by a law firm, but by the Conte's personal security detail. Giovanni had ensured the watch never touched a pawn shop shelf again after its initial recovery, guarding it with the same honor he had used to expose my son's lies. I pulled over at a rest stop near the airport, the morning sun finally breaking through the heavy lake-effect clouds. Inside, nestled in a new, unpretentious wooden box, was my father's 1982 Omega Seamaster. There was a handwritten note from Conte Giovanni that simply read, "For the man who balanced the books with honor." I touched the glass face and felt my father's pulse, not my son's greed. The cool steel against my skin was a weight that finally felt right again, a constant in a world of erratic variables. Time is a circle, they say. But tonight it felt like a straight line pointing directly at a future I had finally earned the right to see. Days later, the Cleveland gray was replaced by the salt spray of the Mediterranean hitting my face. I stood on the balcony of the cruise ship, the rhythmic sound of the engines a low, comforting bass note beneath the cry of the gulls. Before I described the final winding of the watch under a Greek sunset, Are you still holding on to this story with me? Comment A if you think Frank found peace, or B if he just found a new beginning, and add one short reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. If this crosses your comfort line, you can leave now, no pressure. I felt the warmth of the golden light on my shoulders, smelling of expensive sunscreen and freedom. I received a final, unexpectedly civil call from Patricia, while Maggie was inside our adjoining cabin getting ready for dinner. Frank. I think for the first time in 30 years, I'm not worried about what the boys are doing, she said, her voice sounding lighter than I had ever heard it. I'm just worried about what's for lunch. She had officially cut Alex off, moving to a smaller life where the currency was peace instead of prestige. Click, 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 the sound of a life finally in sync. I performed the winding ritual, but the clicks of the mechanism didn't sound like a countdown tonight. They sounded like a heartbeat. I realized that by disinheriting my sons and funding the scholarship, I had actually become more respected in my home city than Alex ever was in Italy. The legacy was finally where it belonged, in the hands of people who would build rather than burn. I looked at Maggie as she joined me on the deck, the golden light of the Mediterranean sunset reflecting in her eyes. I looked back at the watch, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care what the time was, I only cared that it was mine. Monday, December 1st, 2025. I didn't need to check my wrist to know the time. For the first time in 40 years, the rhythm of the world was dictated by my breathing, not the mechanical ticking of a dead man's expectations. The Mediterranean was waiting, but Cleveland had one last transaction to settle. Maggie sat beside me as we pulled into the Brew and Bean drive-thru, the cold morning air at the window smelling of wet asphalt and burnt espresso beans. Tyler was working the window, his eyes bloodshot from a shift he once mocked. He recognized my sedan, his expression shifting from exhaustion to a desperate hope. I noticed he was wearing a cheap plastic watch, a black rubber strap that looked like a toy. It was a stark visual contrast to the steel legacy he had pawned for a gambling debt that never paid out. 2 black coffees. Tyler, I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. I handed him the money. Keep the change. You're going to need it for the fare. Dad, wait. I've been thinking about the car, he began, his voice cracking. I didn't let him finish. I simply handed him a printed bus schedule. The era of bailouts was officially over. Have you ever looked at a person you raised and realized they are finally, mercifully, a stranger? It's the most honest form of freedom there is. I pulled away from the window, leaving my son to the consequences of his own arithmetic. We headed toward Hopkins International, the car heater struggling against the November chill. Maggie didn't say a word. She just reached over and squeezed my hand, her presence a constant that didn't require a calculation. I could feel the Omega Seamaster sitting snugly against my skin, the specific click of the watch clasp providing a grounding weight. We arrived at the terminal, the atmosphere humming with the kinetic energy of departure and the faint, sweet smell of stale airport Cinnabon. Do you have your passport? Frank, Maggie asked, her eyes twinkling as we stood in the check-in line. Or are you still checking the safe for it? I touched the tactile smoothness of my leather passport cover. The only thing I'm checking today, Maggie, is my pulse. It's finally steady. Passport, ticket, watch, soul, all present and accounted for. I realized that I wasn't running away from the wreckage of my sons. I was moving at a velocity they could no longer maintain. As we cleared the security gate, the muffled roar of jet engines in the distance sounded like an invitation rather than a threat. Just as I stepped onto the moving walkway, my phone chirped with a final notification. The Patrick Sullivan Scholarship had just received its first corporate matching donation from the Conte's firm in Italy, doubling the fund's reach. My father's steel was finally building something that would outlast us all. I looked back one last time at the sliding glass doors of the terminal, seeing the gray Cleveland sky reflected there, and realized I couldn't see my own reflection, only the bright, beckoning lights of the gate ahead. The sensation of the plane lifting off was a stomach drop of ascent that usually brings fear, but today it only brought a smile. I watched the sprawling gray grid of Cleveland diminish until it was nothing but a memory tucked behind a layer of clouds. JFK is a city of transit, where nobody belongs to anyone, a sprawling limestone cathedral dedicated to the art of leaving your past at the baggage claim. Maggie and I navigated the bustling terminal during our layover with a rhythm that felt entirely new. We found a quiet wine bar tucked away from the main terminal surge, a dim alcove where the hum of airport ventilation provided a steady, mechanical white noise. I ordered a bottle of expensive Cabernet, the tart, oaky smell of the wine rising from the glasses, as I realized this was my first act of pure, unmanaged fun in decades. Maggie leaned back, her eyes reflecting the flickering blue of the flight status monitors. She admitted that she had almost turned down this trip because she feared I would eventually reopen the safe for my sons. Seeing me delete Tyler's last text without even reading it, she said gave her the certainty she needed to finally say yes. I used to calculate the cost of a layover in terms of lost productivity, I told her. Now I'm just enjoying the way the sunlight hits the glass. You're not a line item anymore, Frank, she replied. You're the whole book. A layover is the comma in the sentence of a journey. It gives you just enough time to breathe before the verb takes over again. We sat in that liminal space between the life I had survived and the one I was starting. Maggie asked to see the Omega Seamaster up close. I unclasped it, feeling the cool steel against my palm before handing it to her. Before I show you how the winding ritual has changed and what it means for my future. Are you still with me? Comment A if you think Frank is finally free, or B if the past always lingers, and tell me why. Please note the next part may not mirror real events exactly, as some details are adapted for storytelling. The purpose is reflection and learning. If that's not for you, you're free to stop here. I took the watch back, the metal catching the light. I no longer wind it to keep my father's ghost alive, Maggie. I wind it to remind myself that I am the one turning the gears of my own life now. It doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels like a compass. Good, she said, her voice steady, because we're heading due east and I don't plan on looking back. Rome. The name didn't sound like a destination anymore. It sounded like an answer. The boarding announcement for our flight to Italy echoed through the lounge, a resonant call to the next chapter. I checked my bank app one last time and felt a strange, cold jolt of satisfaction. The Patrick Sullivan Memorial Scholarship had just received an anonymous 5-figure donation from a friend in Italy. I knew immediately it was the Conte, ensuring my legacy would thrive, while Alex's carefully constructed facade continued to crumble into the dust of Lake Como. The variables had finally been canceled out of the equation. We stood and walked toward the gate, the weight of my single suitcase a testament to my new lightness. As we stepped onto the jet bridge, the sudden pressurized silence of the tunnel enveloped us. The heavy door thudded shut behind us, and for the first time in 60 years, I didn't feel like I was holding the door for anyone else. I was simply walking through it. Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025, day 3 of the cruise. The Greek sun doesn't just illuminate a landscape. It acts as a bleaching agent, stripping away the gray grime of a Cleveland winter until all that remains is the salt of the sea and the clarity of the present. I stood on the deck of the luxury cruiser in Piraeus, the low tectonic vibration of the ship humming through the soles of my shoes. The air was salt-heavy and warm, a stark contrast to the pressurized silence of the jet bridge I had left behind in New York. Maggie and I settled into our adjoining suites, and for the first time in 60 years, I felt a total lack of urgency in my chest. I had spent my life managing the clocks of others, but now the only variables that mattered were the direction of the wind and the depth of the blue water. The entry twist arrived as we were being welcomed aboard. I realized the cruise line is actually owned by a parent company that the Conte's firm handles the textiles for, making me an inadvertent VIP guest of the very man Alex tried to scam. I received a final respectful email from Conte Giovanni wishing me buon viaggio and confirming that the first Sullivan Scholarship student had started their orientation. "You're smiling at your phone," Frank Maggie said, leaning against the railing with a glass of dry Greek white wine. "I hope it's not another audit." "It's a balance sheet, Maggie," I replied. "For once, the numbers are exactly where they should be. A sunset in the Aegean isn't an ending. It's just the universe resetting the variables for a new day." We watched as the ship carved a white path through the water, moving with a grace that Alex's desperate social climbing could never mimic. The ship anchored off the caldera of Santorini as the sun began its slow, magnificent descent toward the horizon. The blinding white reflection of Santorini's cliffs turned to liquid gold as the light shifted. I stood on the private balcony, the smooth, cold weight of the 1982 Omega Seamaster in my palm. 16 clicks. One for every decade of my father's labor, and one for every year I was finally going to live for myself. I performed the winding ritual, but the clicks didn't sound like a countdown. They sounded like a heart that had finally found its rhythm. My father gave me this steel to remind me that my time belonged to me. I told Maggie my thumb finding the crown. It took me 60 years to actually hear him. I discovered a single unsent draft in my email to Alex from months ago, a long, angry list of grievances. I finally deleted it, realizing that even my silent anger was a debt I no longer needed to collect. The ledger was clean. I looked at Maggie, the Santorini light catching the silver in her hair and the warmth in her eyes. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look at the watch to see how much time I had left, I just let it tick. Friday, December 5th, 2025. Day 5 of the cruise at sea between Mykonos and Crete. Blood creates descendants, but only shared sacrifice creates a legacy. And I was about to find out exactly whose future I had bought with the wreckage of my own past. I sat on the ship's observation deck, the blinding white glare of the sun on the water forcing me to squint even behind my polarized lenses. The rhythmic thrum of the cruiser's massive engines was a low, comforting vibration that seemed to sync with my own pulse. I held the smooth tablet screen in my hands, waiting for the final dossier from the Patrick Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Board to load. When the file finally opened, I found myself reading the essay of our very first recipient, a young woman named Maria Gonzalez. Her words about the value of a second chance and unearned grace were mathematically precise in their honesty. Then the midpoint twist hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Maria's essay mentioned that her father had been the same man who stood up for Patrick Sullivan during the 1985 steel mill strike, a detail of my father's history I had never known. The debt wasn't just being paid, it was being returned to the source. "She wants to study mechanical engineering," Maggie, I whispered as she sat beside me. "She wants to build things that last." Maggie set down her drink, the glass clinking softly against the metal table as she leaned in to read over my shoulder. "My father would have liked her," I said, feeling a soul-deep vindication. He wouldn't have understood the calculus, but he would have understood the calluses of her father, the same hands that once stood beside him on a picket line 40 years ago. If a man loses 2 sons but gains 100 futures, is he still bankrupt? I looked at the numbers on the screen and saw a surplus that no bank could ever audit. We moved to the aft deck, watching the wake of the ship disappear into the vast, shimmering blue of the Mediterranean. I realized then that Alex and Tyler were likely still struggling in the shadows of their own making, chasing ghosts in Milan or Cleveland. But I had successfully transferred my father's steel into a vessel that wouldn't leak. The air here smelled of ozone and expensive sea salt, a fragrance of freedom that I was finally allowed to breathe. I was no longer a father to thieves, Maggie. I was a patron to builders. The math finally balances. Zero sum, but 100% pure. The safe was empty. The bank was full. The war was over. I watched the final notification pop up on the screen, a plan reveal that gave me the ultimate peace of mind. The scholarship had been officially endowed for 50 years, structured with such legal density that Alex and Tyler could never touch a cent of it even after I was gone. My legacy was no longer a target. It was a fortress. I felt the cool Mediterranean wind on my face, and for the first time since my father died in that hospital bed, I didn't feel the need to look back at the shore or wonder if I had done enough. I had protected the integrity of the Sullivan name by removing the people who sought to auction it off. I stood up from the deck chair, the wind catching the pages of the essay I'd printed out earlier, their rustle a sharp, clean sound against the roar of the sea. I reached into my pocket, felt the steady weight of the omega, and then let my hand drop. The screen of my tablet went dark, and I turned my back to the horizon, finally finished with the accounting of my life. Looking back now, I realized the hardest truth wasn't what my sons did to me. It was what I allowed for too long. This family story taught me that love without boundaries can slowly turn into permission for betrayal. For years, I believed that being a good father meant sacrificing everything, even my dignity. But a family story like mine proves that generosity without wisdom can become a weapon used against you. If you are listening to this, learn from my mistake. Do not confuse loyalty with blindness. Even in a painful family story, truth eventually reveals who people really are. Some people call what happened a dad revenge, but to me it was never about revenge. Real dad revenge is not hurting your children back. It's refusing to let them destroy the values you worked your whole life to build. My choice was simply to protect my father's legacy and reclaim my peace. If there is a lesson in this dad revenge, it's this: respect must exist in both directions, even between a parent and a child. I also learned something deeper about faith. There were nights when anger almost consumed me, but I believe God allowed this trial to open my eyes. Sometimes God removes the illusion of family so that we can finally see the truth about ourselves and the people around us. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: do not wait until betrayal forces you to stand up for yourself. Protect your values early. Love people, but never at the cost of losing your own soul. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. I would truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were placed in a situation like Frank Miller facing betrayal from his own sons? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this story moved you in any way, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories about family choices and personal redemption. And a small note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real social themes about family trust and inheritance conflict, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't your style, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better. 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 may suit you better, 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 may suit you better.